Stats that matter presented by Penske. When you gain the right transportation partner, your business gains ground. Here are the most added players in fantasy this week. Couple LA Rams at the top of the waiver wire. Tutu Atwell was up there as well, just outside the top 10. So 3 of the top 12 are Rams players. Now, Puka Nacua is at the very top, the most added after his great debut, the second most yards in a debut for a wide receiver taken 5th round or later. He was a 5th round pick out of BYU, had 119 receiving yards in his debut. So let's get Heath Cummings and Dave Richard in here to talk most added, most dropped, most traded, and a couple of other developments that we've seen here on this Wednesday. And we'll start with Puka. I mean, you got to expect him to be good the next couple of weeks. Is this sustainable throughout the season when Cooper Kupp comes back?
I think it can be, because Matthew Stafford, that's the key to this whole thing, is Matthew Stafford under center. And as long as he's there, this Rams offense will throw the ball and push the ball downfield. And when Cooper Kupp comes back, and I have to preface and I have to say this, if Cooper Kupp comes back, then yeah, I think Nacua, obviously the targets won't be as high. 15 targets, that's a stat that matters. That might be cut in half, but still 8 targets for your number 2 receiver. That'll see number 2 coverage. I think that's a good thing. I do think Puka Nacua will be a thing all year long for fantasy managers.
Yeah, is it sustainable when Cooper Kupp comes back? No. But could he be a starter? Maybe. Definitely worth a roster spot when
More
Cooper
so
Kupp's
than
on the
Atwell?
roster.
Yes, I would say yes.
I would definitely choose him over Atwell. I would choose him over Van Jefferson. I think he'll be the number 2 wide receiver, probably the number 2 target earner. But there's a good chance that in this offense, that means, like you said, Dave, he's getting 7 targets a game, and he's just someone that maybe we flex on a bye week.
To the running back position, and it's a Rams player who is the most added back, Kyren Williams. Is he their number 1 running back now?
It sure looked like it, especially after the first drive of that game. He had completely dominated Cam Akers up until that 4th quarter when they gave Akers 11 carries trying to run the clock out, and that's about the only thing he ran, because he didn't run the football very far. 29 carries, 22 carries for 22 yards. We've seen this up and down relationship between Akers and Sean McVay. It's swung down again. I would expect Kyren Williams to lead the team in touches this week.
It's against San Francisco, though, and this is a brutal matchup. So you might have picked up Kyren Williams, and you might be using him to replace J.K. Dobbins or to replace Cam Akers on the same team. But I can't expect him to have a good game fantasy-wise, maybe 12 PPR points at max, because he can catch the ball in the backfield. I think he's playing more because he's the better pass protector. And again, going back to what I said about Puka Nacua, Matthew Stafford is what matters in this offense. So the more that they can do to protect Stafford, the better that this offense will be. Williams is also a good route runner and a good hands guy. We saw that in Notre Dame. I think that's why he's on the field playing more and doing more than Cam Akers. I don't think as a runner he's particularly special.
If you didn't get Williams on the waiver wire and you were looking for a running back, maybe you got Joshua Kelley, and maybe things are looking up for you if you did, and maybe things are looking down for Austin Eckler, who's not practicing today, guys.
I think it's worth keeping an eye on, obviously, if you've got Eckler on your fantasy team, and if you're playing the guy in your league that has Austin Eckler, you might want to go and grab Joshua Kelley before they do. But Kelley looked good, and he looked good in the preseason as well. It's the first time in several years that he's actually looked and played great. He went up against the Dolphins defense. I think against the run, they could have some liabilities this year, so take that for what it's worth. But I ultimately think that if Eckler plays, he's still going to be the main guy, and Kelley should belong on fantasy benches. If Eckler doesn't play, then you go ahead and you start Joshua Kelley with no reservations as a number 2 fantasy running back.
And I think that's the thing, is we're expecting that Austin Eckler will be okay. Maybe not this week, but definitely the following week. But there are a lot of backup running backs that were drafted on the draft day. Joshua Kelley was not one of those. He has vaulted to the top, if not the very top, of the backup running backs who you can't even consider starting when the starter's there. But if that starter goes down, Kelley would be at least a top 20 running back. He might be a top 12 guy.
J.K. Dobbins out for the season, obviously, so trying to pick up the pieces with either Justice Hill or Gus Edwards. Those guys were both in the top 10, most added. If you could pick one right now, which one has more upside?
I would choose Justice Hill because he can catch passes and because he was the guy who was used inside of the 5-yard line in their most recent game. I do think there's a very good chance that Ravens starting running back is just not a good person to roster this season. What we've seen in the past in Greg Roman's offense is most of the running backs can be efficient because of how much they design plays for Lamar Jackson. There were very few designed Lamar Jackson runs, and we saw the running back yards per attempt really suffer because of that. None of these guys are going to be starters, but he'll be my favorite.
I'll go and make the case for Gus Edwards because we've seen him before in the backfield in Baltimore, put up some good numbers and do some good things. It's been a while since we've seen it. I think you've got to go back like 3 years in order to find it. And Justice Hill, he's been in the NFL for a long time, 4 years. He's had 69 carries. He has 1 carry of 20-plus yards. He has 17 catches. He doesn't even have a catch of 16 or more yards. So for a guy as small as he is, he's not explosive. And it was weird seeing him as the short yardage guy last week when Gus Edwards was active and available. We'll see if that keeps up in Baltimore. And if it does, then maybe Justice Hill has a chance to finally break through in his 5th year.
There were some leagues where Kenneth Gainwell was available, and after last week, some went and picked him up. I did that in one of my leagues, and man, he might not play this week. Rashad Penny was one of the most dropped players. Is he going to end up being one of the most picked up players today?
I think so. There's already reports saying that Kenneth Gainwell with his rib injury will not play on Thursday. It's a short week turnaround for Philadelphia, and it's a great matchup against the Minnesota Vikings. And Rashad Penny is rested. He's ready. He can go out there and play. But I'm not sure if he'll be the main guy. In fact, I'm not even sure if he'd be the second best guy because the Philadelphia Eagles still have DeAndre Swift, who we barely saw anything from in week 1. You know he's going to get more work. You heard Nick Sirianni talk about him getting more work. And they've got Boston Scott as well. And if we talked about Boston Scott playing against the Giants, we'd be making the joke about all he does is score touchdowns against the Giants. It's not the Giants this week, it's the Vikings. But he still could be in a role ahead of Penny where he ends up stealing some work. I think the bottom line is you just stay away from all Eagles running backs if you can help it.
I would want to add Penny because I think we might see what happened last week with a variety of different running backs throughout the season. You won't be able to count on them for a long range, but if you give DeAndre Swift 18 touches on Thursday night, I think he's probably going to be a starting fantasy running back. If Rashad Penny gets 18 touches at some point, he's probably going to be a starting fantasy running back. And it makes sense to me that Penny was not active last week and then might jump ahead of Scott this week just because they're not going to play Rashad Penny on special teams, so you don't activate him as a 4th running back. But now that they only have 3, I would expect Scott to still be the 3rd.
Okay, we're talking most dropped players this week in fantasy and going to the wide receiver position. If there was ever a week for Skyy Moore to do his thing, it would have been last week, right?
Sure.
With Travis Kelley out of the game. It just did not happen. He was only targeted 3 times and did not have a single catch.
Absolutely disastrous for his redraft value, his dynasty value. You have no reason to have any faith. Listen, he's attached to Patrick Mahomes, so I'd like to try to hold on for 1 more week. It was just 1 week, but I would much rather drop Skyy Moore than the guy who dropped passes all last week Thursday, Kadarius Toney. I still think he's Mahomes' favored target, and we're hoping Travis Kelce comes back this week.
I think both guys belong on fantasy benches. I wouldn't want to cut either one of them. The nice thing about Skyy Moore is that he's still young, he's still learning the offense, and the receivers that they have in Kansas City, along the perimeter, I don't know if they've got anybody that's necessarily great with Rashee Rice or Marquez Valdez-Scantling. You're looking at somebody who can win over the middle of the field, and that's usually Kelsey's territory anyway. I want to sit these guys and just see what happens over the next week or two, not having to want to trust them. But Skyy Moore has talent, and he's a good after-catch type of receiver. Heath's right. He should have had a huge breakout game. Should have had at least double the amount of targets that he had in week 1. But he didn't do it. He didn't have any catches, but he didn't have 3 drops either. And he'll play more than Kadarius Toney moving forward.
Okay, let's move to the most traded players. And on top of that list, a couple of guys who won't play for another 3 weeks, Cooper Kupp and Jonathan Taylor. What's the value for these guys right now if you have them and you're looking to unload?
Well, I think the only reason you should be looking to unload is if you lost week 1, and more likely if you lose week 2. Like if I'm sitting at 500 or better, there's no chance that I'm getting rid of these guys because Cooper Kupp could still be the best wide receiver in fantasy as soon as week 5. We saw it last year. The games that he played in, he was every bit as good as he was in 2021. 2.5 points better than anybody else has been over the last 5 years. Jonathan Taylor could still be a top 5 running back. Anthony Richardson was so much better as a passer than we thought. The combination of Richardson and Taylor, this could be fantastic. So I'm not panic selling these guys unless I fall into an 0-2 hole.
And I would still need to get at least 2 starters back in exchange for them if I'm 0-2 and I'm struggling along. I want to be able to win, but I don't want to give these guys away. These were primo draft picks on draft day. So if you go and you trade them away and you just get like 1 decent starter, I don't think that that's enough. You've got to make sure that the manager that you trade with pays what's appropriate for these guys. Right now, the value for Kupp, I think, is as a number 2 wide receiver, and Taylor, kind of a top 20-ish type of fantasy running back. We don't know when they're going to be back. The report that Jonathan Taylor could clear the PUP list and be back by week 5 and be active That's a good sign. That's a positive for him.
Okay, so don't look at trading those unless you lose again this week after a loss in week 1.
And get something good for him. You can't just trade him away for nothing.
I'm gonna put that aside because I've got Jonathan Taylor in one of my leagues. DK Metcalf was also among the most traded. He found the end zone, but he only had 3 catches on 5 targets. So, I mean, should you buy low on him right now if somebody's willing to sell?
I absolutely would. I'm not ready to say that Geno Smith is a lost cause after 1 game, and he will have some tough matchups down the line where he's going to get pressured a lot, and maybe even week 2 is one of those games. But DK Metcalf is his best receiver. We took him as the top receiver off the board in drafts as the #1 target getter in Seattle, and I think he'll continue to be. Plus, he's a great red zone threat. So if you can get him on the cheap, if people are unhappy with what he did in week 1, go take advantage of it. That's somebody that I would want to have on my fantasy team and acquire as maybe a #2 fantasy wide receiver. For some teams, he might have been drafted as their #1.
Yeah, I mean, he was a 3rd-round pick according to ADP, 4th round on some sites. What I'm thinking is he scored that touchdown. It saved me. Go show the other fantasy manager. He scored 13 points. He's still DK Metcalf, and ship that guy out. I am terrified that Jackson Smith-Njigba is going to be the #1 wide receiver by the second half of this season for Seattle, and I was even more scared by how Geno Smith looked. It looked like he turned back into Geno Smith.
Or at least some of those guys did something. I mean, you had guys like Drake London and T. Higgins do absolutely nothing. Higgins targeted 8 times but didn't make a catch.
These are the kind of guys where I say, I'm happy with the usage, and I'm just going to forget about the performance. I would assume this is a bunch of people going out and trying to make buy low offers and saying, ha, he didn't score any fantasy points. Give him to me for cheap. That's what I'm doing with T. Higgins this week.
Michael Pittman had a big game. Brandon Ayuk had a big game. Those guys you could turn into T. Higgins right now, and I would absolutely sign off on that. I think Higgins will be better than those receivers, at least more consistent than Ayuk rest of season.
Okay, you can find much more on this on the fantasy page at cbssports.com. Dave Richard and Heath Cummings with us here. You can also hear Jamie Eisenberg and Adam Azer and others. Fantasy Football Today podcast. You can't start 0-2. I can't start 0-2. Come on, got to turn things around this week. These guys are going to help you do it.